It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. You can catch new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver on Wednesdays, but Mondays are for me to talk about monster movies. With the upcoming release of the new Invisible Man remake from Universal and Blumhouse Productions, let's talk about the original adaptation of H.G. Wells' 1897 novel. This brings back several things that I've covered over the last 14 months of Monster Mondays episodes. Naturally, this was part of the original Universal Classic Monsters cycle coming out just after 3 Monster Mondays alumni, Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Mummy. Speaking of Frankenstein, it is also directed by James Whale. Finally, the lead role of Dr. Jack Griffin is played by Claude Rains, who we talked about last October for playing Larry Talbot's father in The Wolfman. Now, we've talked about Whale and Rains before, but this time there's a little intrigue. Originally, producer Carl Laemmle Jr. wanted Boris Karloff to play Griffin because, well, you know, Karloff was massively popular playing Frankenstein's monster and The Mummy. He was a bit of a universal golden boy. That said, Laemmle Jr. kept trying to get Karloff to basically decrease his contractual salary, so Karloff bailed. To replace the star, the studio considered Boston Blackie star Chester Morris, future Oscar winner Paul Lucas, and Colin Clive, who had played Dr. Frankenstein. Ultimately, Whale would choose Claude Rains when Whale was chosen to replace the original director, Cyril Gardner. Now, according to my source of info, Claude Rains was 100% James Whale's choice. And I'd like to think that Whale had a considerable amount of clout after Frankenstein, so when he chose Rains, Universal was probably perfectly fine with that choice. And for a couple of other reasons, too. One, they trusted Whale. Whale chose Rains because of the bravado of his voice. And that's really important in this part because you never actually see Claude Rains' face when he's speaking in this movie. Also, Rains was a relative unknown. He was brand new not to acting because he had done stage work before, but he'd never really been that big in movies yet. So he was probably cheap for Universal. So my guess is that they didn't just trust Whale. They probably also liked that Claude Rains probably didn't cost much at that point in time. Now, this was a particularly tough production. Apparently, there were issues adapting the novel to script. Without the issues, the film would have likely been released much earlier than the November 1933 opening, because those script and story issues caused the entire project to be temporarily suspended in the summer of 32. Eventually, things got sorted out, and The Invisible Man went into production from June to August 1933. However, the final days of production was delayed when an accident caused a fire that burned down some external sets. The film did finally come out, as previously mentioned, in November of 1933 to largely positive reviews and considerable popularity among audiences. Wells himself even enjoyed the film, except for the fact that he didn't really like the idea that his Griffin would be changed from a deeply corrupted but brilliant scientist to the film's version, which was basically a complete stark raving madman. But Whale defended his film, saying that the general audience would only believe a madman would want to be invisible to begin with. Now, personally, I find it interesting that Wells had that specific criticism that he couldn't condone when it was generally known that Griffin was insane in the novel. He's uniquely crazy for power, which causes him to create the invisibility stuff so that he could steal from his father and live out some of his power fantasies. In the movie, Griffin is a bit more sympathetic, with his invisibility potion being what is actually driving him to do more and more insane acts and behave more insanely. In a way, I guess it seems as though Wells prefers his character to be a real villain more than a guy whose ambition leads him to losing a great deal. Now, on a cold, dark, and snowy night, a man whose face is entirely covered in bandages and wearing a pair of goggles walks into the town of Iping in Sussex and enters the Lion's Head, a pub and inn where he requests a room with a fire and a sitting area. The locals try to figure out what this mysterious man's business is and why his identity is hidden. Similarly to the Frankenstein movie, the man, Dr. Jack Griffin, is engaged to a woman named Flora, whose father is a bit of a colleague and mentor to Griffin, and he also has another scientist friend who also knows Griffin well and tries to soothe Flora's concerns while also kind of making a play for her. And I want to bring up Flora because she's played by Gloria Stewart. Guys, if you were dating a lady in late 1997 or early 1998, or you were a lady at that time, you very likely saw Stewart in her most famous role, that of the elderly version of Rose in James Cameron's Titanic. She is, to this day, the oldest Oscar nominee in the category of Best Supporting Actress. Okay, back to the movie proper. Now, the owner of the Lion's Head tries to evict Griffin for being a grump and for making a mess of his room. Griffin refuses to leave and throws the man down the stairs. When a policeman comes to arrest Griffin for the assault, Griffin removes his bandages and goggles to reveal he is, indeed, the Invisible Man. While he cackles insanely, Griffin initially scares off the locals gathered in the room, and then he disrobes the toy with the cop and the inn's owner. He beats them up before escaping out into the town to terrorize everyone else. We learn that an ingredient of Griffin's formula is a dangerous drug known as monocaine. Monocaine, when tested on a dog in Germany, drove it insane. Dr. Cranley, Flora's father, deduces that Griffin, not aware of the danger of monocaine, must have noticed its initial property written in old books as a bleaching agent and then used it in his formula that is driving him mad. That night, Griffin shows up in the home of Dr. Kemp, a colleague, and the guy that's his friend that's kind of going after Flora as well. He demands a place to sleep, some bandages, and for Kemp to say nothing to anyone. Griffin explains to Kemp that something in the drugs did something to his mind, and he realized the power he had and how much he wants to rule the world. You know, normal, sane people things. He wants Kemp to be the visible partner to his plans and a henchman to carry out some of the dirty deeds. Kemp helps Griffin retrieve his notebook and works at the end, and try to get that stuff from that he abandoned at the Lion's Head. But in doing so, he also takes out his revenge on a cop, and Griffin accidentally kills him. Now, if you do some math, it's easy to see that when someone kills a cop, that only makes all the cops want to come after that person a little bit more. And that's what happens here. The town boards itself up while the cops scour the streets. Kemp, cracking under the stress of having a complete nut in his house, calls Dr. Cranley first and hopes to get him over to his house, but when Cranley says he should drop by normally in the morning as opposed to late at night, Kemp then decides to call the cops. When Griffin discovers Kemp betrayed him, Griffin goes nuts and says he will kill Kemp tomorrow night at 10 p.m. And he does, by tying him inside his car and sending him off a cliff. Kemp is killed in the fiery explosion, probably one of the earliest fiery explosions in cinema history. You know, that's that old trope where you send the car off a cliff and it explodes. That's probably one of the earlier examples of that. Griffin escapes through a snowstorm and hides in a barn. The police flush him out by setting fire to the barn. And when the head detective on the case sees Griffin's footprints in the snow, he shoots him. And in the hospital before dying, he tells Flora he done messed around with stuff he probably shouldn't have, and when he dies, he becomes visible again. So let's get to my 3 things that I like about the Invisible Man. First, I'm going to roll a couple of things up into one larger idea. There's a preposterous element to the story that I just love. The fact that simply having a single invisible man with a visible goon could bend the world to that invisible person's will and make that person the most powerful person to ever lived is insanity. And, well, I mean, I guess that's the point, right? Griffin is completely nuts. While it is Monocaine that has driven him insane, he sees only the power that this could have. First, he can learn secrets of kings, traipse into gold vaults of countries all over the world, and bring enemies to their knees. Then, when he's a little less frothy in the mouth, while he's talking to Flora during the scene before the cops come to Kemp's, he says that he could sell the formula to the country who makes the highest bid, and he could receive thousands, millions, in fact. Then that country can take over the world. Oh, that sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? Until then, though, Griffin is just happy being a jerk to people around the village. There are some really funny scenes of Griffin simply trolling people while sometimes singing nursery rhymes. Being this is a James Whale film, you also have some of the trademark things in this that he often did in a lot of his movies. First, Una O'Connor's shrieking wife of the Lion's Head owner doing her mugging and screeching. I mean, that's you see that a lot in Bride of Frankenstein. It's certainly here. It's such an over-the-top character. It's hilarious. There are also other landmark and hallmark James Whale characters who are kind of schlubby locals who give cartoonish facial expressions and reactions to things going on. It's just the over-the-top stuff that it's a signature thing with James Whale. Some people wouldn't take very well to it. I think it's kind of hilarious in an otherwise, serious, maybe even a horror film, certainly a thriller, to have these kind of over-the-top goofy characters. It's kind of funny. Now, second, the special effects for this movie are quite good in a time that isn't all that well known for optical effects. Both Invisible Man and King Kong came out in 1933, and both utilize effects that had a heavy effect and impact on the art of cinema. The effect to show an invisible man was done in a couple of ways. First, whenever Griffin was not wearing clothes, they just had this wire system set up to move things around as if someone was carrying or operating something. When he was dressed and or in the process of removing clothing, Raines had to wear a black velvet suit that would basically be composited in a way to remove him from sight in editing. Raines was claustrophobic and would struggle to breathe in that suit. And because of this, they sometimes had to use a body double. There was the other effect of Raines going from invisible to visible that involved a mask of Raines shot against a specific type of background. And then some lab work came into the process, and it was completed in post-production in another composite type of effect. The whole effect was created by John Fulton, John Mescal, and Frank Williams. They were a trio of cinematographers. Williams was an early pioneer. Mescal often worked with Whale. And Fulton was an early visual effects supervisor in the business, racking up 8 total Oscar nominations for special photographic effects. 3 of those nominations were for the sequels to The Invisible Man, while a 4th was for The Ten Commandments. Remember, these effects are much more photographic effects and camera effects. They didn't have computers to do this. It literally was all about shooting something multiple times and piecing it together. It is a spectacular effect that required a great deal of ingenuity and time and effort to get it right. Lastly, Claude Rains is someone I gave this label to in my episode for The Wolfman, but he is often considered one of the greatest actors of not just that era, but possibly of all time. He was nominated 4 times for Best Supporting Actor. for Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Casablanca, Mr. Skeffington, and Notorious. And he was a Tony Award winner for a leading actor in Darkness at Noon. And he's a truly great actor. And despite being in big-time dramas and highly received films, he was still in some of these Universal monster movies. Not only was he the Invisible Man and the Wolfman's dad, but he also played the Phantom of the Opera in the 1943 version, which was a Technicolor film, which you can argue what belongs in the Universal Classics monster cycle, but of the big characters, like the main, like your tentpole character monsters, Phantom of the Opera, that 1943 version was the only one in color. So, I mean, that's a big deal, and he's phenomenal in it. As Griffin, though, Raines shines without ever really seeing his face. You cannot see him emote. And his voice carries this movie all by itself. That's why he was selected to be this character, was because of that voice he had. And he's kind of reveling in the portrayal of the insane Griffin. One of the most underrated things in the whole world of performance art is when someone is just lets it all hang out as a villain. Cackling, cracking jokes, singing nursery rhymes, threatening world domination and great personal threats to any of those people who might defy him. It's a hard thing to do. And, you know, I mean, think about that if you're not an actor. Think about it as somebody who can't even understand the basics of acting, trying to figure out how to act when nobody can see your face and they can't see you emote. That takes an awful lot of talent to do. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Until next week, I'll see you later. And don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com. You can also find those at places where fine podcasts are found, like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. You can also check out new posts at my website, bmovieanima.com, each and every Friday.